There it is. It had options. I couldn't just hit the button once. All right, well, we've already been a little bit into the discussion, but this is the Ruby Under a Microscope book club meeting in the American and APAC time zone friendly time. So we will continue the discussion. Some talking points are already in the GitLab, or the, sorry, Google Doc. So for the few minutes that were missed in the recording, feel free to check that out. So I thought it was really interesting. I think this kind of adds on to your comment. I'm probably going to say your name wrong. Aishwarya?
Yeah, you can call me Aish if that's easy.
Aish, okay. Just like how much is going on under the hood. Like I think there was one point where they had us run like Ripper on some simple code example. And I was just like blown away with like how much output there was for that simple file. All of the stuff that's reporting on doing, which is probably not even all of the stuff it's doing, but yeah, it's just kind of, it's kind of understandable then to think of Ruby as a slow language, I guess, if it's doing a lot of stuff. And I don't know if it's because it's dynamic that it has to do so much stuff rather than being statically typed. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think someone pointed out in the other meeting about this chapter that basically, if it was typed, you wouldn't have to do that kind of look ahead where you would just know that this was an integer and you were calling a method on that. So you wouldn't have to do that at all.
Right.
Definitely statically typed languages make it a lot easier for compilation because everything has to be defined up front.
Yeah, I've spent the last couple of years using Typescript, so I got familiar with that concept, which works well when it works, and then when you start fighting it, it becomes becomes such a hassle. You're like, why am I doing this? But yeah,
I definitely gained a new appreciation for like all the stuff that has to happen under the hood for Ruby to be as expressive as it is, and for all these like niceties to happen. It's just like looking at that giant was like 8,000 line parser file to see all the stuff they have to work through.
Yeah, I think there were some comments about that in the other one too, about the fragility perhaps of those language rules, I guess. I don't remember what they're called, but those rules that define the compiled or the generated parser. Like there's a lot going on in there, and like how do you actually test that what you're adding or changing is doing what you want to the language? So that's really...
That code's append only now. They just add to the end of the block.
Yeah. There you go.
There was two gray boxes, one on Bison and one on the other one that mentions the Lexa. They kind of seemed to bump up the complexity and depth of explanation. Are they kind of there, can be independently read of the book? Seems like, I don't know, extra reading and then more detail that's not strictly related to the stuff surrounding it. Yeah,
I like that, but if you really want to deep dive and you want to go into the guts of it, you can if you like, but it's not, I wouldn't call it strictly required, but definitely if you have that kind of interest, you'll be interested in it. But if not, then I think you can skip it and just be like, oh, it works, and that's all I need to care about. But I like that they did that. They gave the option for nerds to go even deeper if they want.
Yeah, it was good having kind of, here's the file you can read and examples of what this does.
Anyone actually read the .y files? Or at least try?
I think I looked it up in the like GitHub repo. I noticed it was quite different than what they showed in the book, which there have been several comments since then about how this book is a little older. So that makes sense. But yeah, it was daunting.
Yeah, I just loaded it up. It's 13,468 lines. So that should be a pleasure to work with. Like you can't even get blame it on GitHub. It times out.
Yeah. It's a nasty beast.
Isn't it a nasty beast, or is it like a hand curated nasty beast?
I think there was an aside in the book that said that it's like hand curated, right?
Yeah, because I think this is the thing that defines the language syntax that then generates the parser that actually parses the language. So I think this is the handwritten part. Yeah. which is even more daunting.
I did look at those and I was like, well, this is fun. I don't know.
Yeah, I actually think Yorick may have commented in the video for the first one. I'm trying to remember if it was in the video, if it's actually written down somewhere. But basically, people who are that deep into working on the Ruby language know it as a specific, like, beastly file that if you have to work in it, it's going to cause headaches.
Well, it kind of had me taking a look, like, as I've been writing code, of sort of like breaking things down into like, what is my code actually made of? Like, okay, like I'm working in a class, I'm in a method, this method has a couple conditionals and some other things. And I was realizing like how many things I was defining the name of, and in just defining the name of something that's like one thing that parser does, is like define things for you at some point. So it was kind of just like realizing that like there's like almost sort of like an elegance to, you can do so much with these, you know, very specified set of rules.
Yeah. Yeah, if you think of like, you know, trying to write a language essentially, especially when it's expressive as Ruby, it's going to take a lot of lines of language rules to get it right. And I think somewhere in the book they mentioned that there are, I don't know if there are comments or just specific sort of like character sequences that only like one of the two things that read from that, so whether it's the ripper or the bison or whatever, like only one of those will read those sections. So that could also be ballooning that file size, which is fun.
One thing I was curious about when I was reading was like, I'm not familiar with how languages are written or much about, you know, how like the people that work on them. But I was curious, like a lot of languages are built on C, and I was kind of curious, like, are there a lot of similarities with other languages that are built on C, or is it like a completely different thing altogether? I don't know if anyone has any knowledge in that area. Could be something to look up maybe for next time though.
It's a really interesting question because it goes right to programming language theory. It kind of makes you wonder, like, could you compile any language in any other language? I'm sure somebody has tried, you know. I mean, I've seen the internet, there's lots of things on it, but yeah. And I mean, I know that certain programming languages just have inherent limitations and strengths. But I wonder if those translate well. Oh, that's an interesting question.
Nice. Any other interesting parts of chapter 1 that people noticed?
That was one. Just another like AST observation of something I thought they explained well was the order of operations affecting how the tree ends up. Like just treating plus and multiply differently. And then how that's expressed. Kind of a part of the language that's not syntax related, but still communicates something just by the shape of the tree.
Yeah, that is really interesting. It was nice to have those diagrams of kind of how that tree is taking shape.
So does the parsing happen at runtime, or does it happen, you know, before it? Like, for example, only when a method is invoked would the parsing of the method happen, or, you know, would it happen otherwise too?
believe it would have to happen at runtime so that it's checking for like syntax errors and things like that.
Is that loading time or running time?
Loading time, I guess would be.
Okay. Sorry, I don't want to split hairs.
I mean, we're talking about a language, so yeah, I guess it's split hair.
Has anyone worked with a lot of compiled languages like Java or other stuff like that?
I briefly worked with Scala, which is built on Java. I didn't learn any Java along the way. Well, I learned a little Java, but yeah, it's definitely a very different feel and ecosystem. But I don't know how much of it was really necessarily due to how it was built. It was more just the fact that it had to be compiled and that it was statically typed.
Yeah, I did a lot of work with statically typed languages, Java mostly, some C#. And I only started doing Ruby like 8 years ago, which feels new to me, even though it's a while ago.
Only 8 years ago.
I used to do C as well, so yeah. I love Ruby, and I'm really happy to know how sophisticated it is under the hood. I thought your comment about how to be as expressive as it is, there's so much more work that goes into lexing it and parsing it, and you don't just say, oh, the user has to do this. Like you have to make sure that you define everything up front. Ruby's like, oh, you know what? It's okay if you don't, because I'll figure it out. And now we have this massive Lex file. So that's why. So, I mean, I know that that's already been said, but I'm really appreciating that comment.
Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder if it's possible or if it would be frowned upon to break that Lexer file up into different chunks and just include the different chunks, or if that's just not possible, like the way it's defined, it just has to all be at once or it's not going to work.
If you can define new sort of wacky metaprogramming stuff or something, if you wanted to do something really wacky, you could be like, oh, I want this chunk, and then you add it to your core, and then you break Ruby or something.
Instead of just core and standard lib, we have like all these different pieces of core that you could include.
I can't include methods anymore.
Sorry, what was that?
I added this cool thing, but now I can't call methods.
Yeah. Broke won't fix.
Like 13,000 lines is a bit much, but I personally don't mind the single big file approach to things. I feel, maybe this is just a JavaScript thing, but they've gone far too far. JavaScript just has thousands of tiny files. And I personally think it's far worse than one big file. Distributed complexity.
Yeah, I guess if your complexity, I mean, I think for a lexer or a parser or something where it's consistent at least, because everyone is using the same thing. But I think if you could customize it, I think it would probably make it a little bit more it would be complex, because then you wouldn't know. You'd have to check if this module is included or that module. And I think it's abstracted away nicely in the one file, and therefore people don't have to think about it. And I think, and outsourced, I guess, to these experts who are experts in this one 13,000, however long it was, long file. And that means everyone else has the luxury of not having to care about it, or at least beyond that it works.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of division of labor, I think, makes it really great.
It looks like about 3 years ago, it was only 11,000 lines. So I'm curious to now to go back and look kind of like what's adding this bulk to it. I mean, obviously the language is constantly changing, but I'm curious how much actually gets added to that parser over time.
I wonder if, as we get further along in the book club, if we could maybe have a look at some of the latest changes to the language, and then we'll be like, oh, hey, we understand this now.
Oh man, coming from like a graphic design background and not like a computer science background, that really makes me anxious, I guess, to think about trying to understand like how Ruby code goes into Lexer code, goes into C code or whatever is after that. But yeah, it's useful information for sure.
It's just, I like this kind of book because it's not directly useful to my day-to-day. And so I wouldn't necessarily read it otherwise. Like much of my university education. It was like not directly useful, but kind of interesting. And I'm glad I learned it in hindsight, but I wouldn't have done it on my own. So thanks everyone.
My sense is that this chapter is probably, although it was really interesting, I think we'll probably get to juicier discussions as we get into some of the stuff past the parsing and lexing, because it's like, oh, this is how it is, and then we can get into more, I don't know, more juicy stuff, especially as it integrates with Rails and our day-to-day stuff, because it feels like this is the kind of thing that's kind of abstracted away, and it's like a kind of a good FYI. Sorry about the construction noise. If anyone else can hear that. But I think that as we get further along, I think it will become more and more relevant. I think the relevance will increase, and therefore we'll have a little bit more to discuss beyond kind of computer science concepts.
I'm just curious, I actually, I'm not a computer science major. Was parsing and tokenization, like, is that a common thing that's covered in university courses, or is that even skipped and it's just, here's how you use the language, for anyone that may know?
Theoretically, I think it ought to be. It's one of those common things that you often find. So I mean, I did theoretical computer science 20 years ago. And yeah, I would think that it would be in a good curriculum. I can go through notes. We did some accreditation work way back, like 10 years ago or something, and we also there was also there are sort of standards that they have to have, and I think that this kind of thing, even if it's not taught directly, you will run into it if you take like a compiler's course, or if you take other courses, like even operating systems and stuff will have it when you get to a deep enough level. So I would hope so. Certainly, I would expect it if I was accrediting a computer science department somewhere. Ask some people and get back to you.
So I had an entire course in the beginning of my graduation for wholly compiled, but it was not specific to any particular language. It was just concepts, theoretical concepts. So we didn't have any practical implications, like no labs or any kind of those stuffs. But yeah, pretty much after that, I don't think I ever went back to these topics.
Makes sense. If you're not going to end up specializing, it doesn't stay on your mind for too long.
It feels a bit like a means to an end rather than an end unto of itself. You do parsing so you can get to somewhere else, not because parsing itself. I mean, and there are some people who specialize in parsing itself so that other people can benefit from that. At least that's my take.
So I've scheduled this one for only the 25-minute blocks. We're coming up on time. Does this feel like the right amount of time, do you think? Maybe. I guess if we had more people, that might have increased the length of the discussion. There was also some talk in the other group of Potentially, and I think they voted it down, but potentially reading 2 chapters at once. Some people found this chapter a little easy. But I think they eventually decided to just keep it to 1 chapter a week. So I'd be happy to do that. If you wanted to do two chapters, so we kind of got back on schedule with where we were supposed to be. Either one of those, like, doesn't matter to me, but happy to hear people's feedback on that.
I like 1. I imagine that, yeah, like I think Charlie was said that after the first couple, then we're more into relatable stuff and it is more discussion, and just having 1 chapter kind of gives us a focus.
Yeah, I agree.
Rather than, then you run the risk of something not getting discussed.
Right. Cool. Sounds good. Then I think we'll leave it there for this week, and we'll see you all next week for chapter 2.
Thanks, y'all.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.